It's important to talk about how you're hurt rather than what the other person is doing. And everybody knows that psychologists say all this sort of stuff. They recommend
use the I
it.
language and
Right. And it is hard to do when you're in an argument and there's a lot of emotions and there's a lot of things going on. But it is important to try to remember it's like another blockage that they're like, you know, let me send this army person out and fight them instead of me sending this soft teddy bear part of me out, right? Because that can get hurt the most.
I know what I should, you know, but it's like, what is the actual, because all of the anger, all the frustration always comes from a hurt or a fear or both.
Right.
And so you got to say, okay, if I feel like I've never been, I'm not being listened to, or I'm hardly ever listened to, what is the actual hurt or fear behind it? Which is that maybe the fear is, I don't feel like I'm worthy of being like, when I don't feel understood, then I don't feel like I'm worthy of being listened to.
I've been on both sides of that,
both
so
sides,
you know how it is.
That's exactly.
But I do think that wording things is also important because it's also not fair, and I'm not saying that you did this, but it's not fair to just shit on your partner, right? Or be like, you never do this and you're always like this and I can't talk to you and you're just so difficult. Like, it is insanely hard for someone to sit there
and listen to, for sure.
And listen to that. Like, if you talk about your vulnerability and like how you're feeling and things that aren't necessarily like an attack on the person, and you might not think it's an attack, but like, I know that any man, if they heard a woman talk to them like that, it would be really hard for them to sit there and be like, she's disrespecting me. Like, she's just trying to shit on me. Like, they would be thinking that. Any person would think that. And so that's why, even if you're in an emotional state, it is important to talk about how you're hurt rather than what the other person is doing. And everybody knows that psychologists say all this sort of stuff. They recommend
use the
it.
I language and
Right. And it is hard to do when you're in an argument and there's a lot of emotions and there's a lot of things going on. But it is important to try to remember that you do need, and people do it too because they're afraid to be vulnerable. They're afraid to say the thing like, when when this happened, or I felt really hurt because there's a part of me that thinks if I make a mistake, then you're not going to love me anymore. Like, that's the hard thing to say.
Right. That's a true vulnerability.
And people put, I think we actually mentioned this in one of the other episodes too. They would rather throw out something like, you don't listen to me. In front of the real vulnerability, because this is almost like another guard. It's like another blockage. That they're like, let me send this army person out and fight them instead of me sending this soft teddy bear part of me out, right? Because that can get hurt the most. But people, and we realize this, people are way more easily able to empathize with you and relate to you because everybody has their own vulnerable, soft parts inside of them. When you come at it from there, from that point.
And the I language is not enough. Because you can still use the I language and still slap someone in the face with
like,
the I
language. Feel like you never listened to me. That's a way to do it.
Or even if you take the you out of the never listen to me, if you say, I feel like I'm never listened to. That's still pointy. It still comes across. So it's really, the key is, like you said, is the vulnerability behind it. Because every frustration you have, everything, and sometimes it's hard to tap into what it is. Like sometimes I even struggle with that. I'm like, I know what I should, but it's like, what is the actual, because all of the anger, all the frustration always comes from a hurt or a fear or both. And so you got to say, okay, if I feel like I've never been, I'm not being listened to, or I'm hardly ever listened to, what is the actual hurt or fear behind it? Which is that maybe the fear is, I don't feel like I'm worthy of being like, when I don't feel understood, then I don't feel like I'm worthy of being listened to, or I'm afraid
nobody cares what I have to say, or something.
I'm afraid
like that.
You'll stop loving me, or I'm afraid that you might not care about, like these are the things that are the real,
the truth,
right? And that's and if you can really tap into that, Because then it really is about you. It's about your experience and what you're feeling and what you're scared of. That's the real vulnerability. Because when you say something that you're scared of, now that fear, someone is not going to react negatively to that because
now they're responsible for how they're going to respond to your fear, right? Because you've done the right thing. You're being vulnerable. And so now if someone lashes out at you, they're the ones that, are trying to hurt you when you're being vulnerable.
Yeah.
And it's not about tit for tat. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying that when you are vulnerable, you're like kind of, I don't want to say invincible, but like you're not doing anything wrong.
Right.
So you don't have to worry about that. Like you're putting that out in the middle of an argument, right? Because when you're in the middle of the argument, there's these emotions and you're like, am I going to say the wrong thing or am I going to make this worse or what? But if you're vulnerable, you don't have to worry about all that. You just have to worry about speaking your truth.
Right.
And you don't know how the other person's going to respond, like you said. And I agree that people typically respond in a more empathizing and compassionate way when you show your vulnerable side.
That's what we were going to name the podcast. I remember we were talking about it when we were talking about this in bed. It was vulnerability makes you invincible. I think
I thought that was the other episode.
Oh, maybe that was the other episode. I don't know, but like we said it at some point. But
I mean, I guess we're just
but it does
pushing that point.
It does make that the case because if you say the thing that actually scares you, that actually hurts you, if it's the truth of really where this is coming from, then even if you get a negative reaction to that, it can't really hurt you because you
took the weight off your own shoulders by putting it out there.
Right. There's nothing to defend because you're naked.
And that's your responsibility. And I do think too, a tip that would be good for us and for anybody.
Yeah.
Because when you're in an argument, it feels very fast paced, right? You're like, I have to say something, especially if you're like in defense mode, you're like, I got to defend myself. I need to say something.
Right.
Like if you're trying, and everybody should be trying to do the right thing and be vulnerable instead, don't feel like you can't be like, hey, can I take a minute to like look inside and understand what's really bothering me and like take a moment, stop the conversation. I mean, I'm not saying like go somewhere else, but sit there for a minute and really think about, okay, I feel this. Where is that coming from inside of me? And then start the conversation back up and be like, okay, so I realized what I'm actually afraid of is that if I act this way around you, then I'm not going to be loved by you anymore. And that's my own sort of fear. Like I'm afraid of that because of either things that have happened in the past or just something that I have always believed and might not be the correct thing. Like I have this fear, like, or this scares me or this hurt me because of this. And so take a minute to like really dig inside yourself to figure out what it is.
Yeah.
That'll also save you a lot of time doing the wrong thing.
And you can even vocalize it. You can even say, I like my body or my mind wants to say this, which I know is the wrong thing to say. So let me figure out what is the actual fear or hurt behind it that is causing me. I feel like you're going to get more empathy with that because you're being honest about like, I want to say this thing that would probably be hurtful to you. But I'm not going to say that because I know that's not the truth. The truth is something that is actually in me. It's hard for someone to react negatively to that. They feel like, okay, you're being really, really honest with me. Like this is, we're operating at a different level. But I think also at the same time, though, on the other side of it, right? So you as a person who's presenting something, an issue or how you're feeling, what we said all applies, right? You want to make sure that you're definitely not using the you language, you're using the I language, and you're figuring out the fear and the vulnerability that's at the bottom of it. But on the other side of it, if you're listening to someone and they're trying to share, you've got to not care what they're saying, right? Unless it's extremely abusive, but you got to realize that, okay, the person who's saying this, there's some kind of fear or hurt that's beneath what they're actually saying. Even though the words might seem offensive, let me let them get that out. Let me give them the space because they might not have the capacity. It's something that you have to work on. But by giving them that grace, then you make them feel heard and understood. And then it's more likely, if you do that, then after you do that, they're going to say, oh, wow, I didn't mean to take it all out on you. I didn't mean to, I shouldn't have said things that way. Or even then you can say afterwards, hey, now that you're feeling better, I want to talk about the way that you express that. And this was my experience of that. Or, now you're dealing with your thing in the right way, because you're then training, you're showing by example how to be, rather than trying to tell. Because if you're on the other side of it and someone's expressing things in the wrong way, nothing that you say is going to change that, right? If they're saying, you did this to me, and then you say, well, maybe you should say it different. They're feeling not understood. They're feeling unheard, right? But if you give them the grace, let them say the thing, realize that having your own emotional maturity to realize that there's a fear or hurt below this. That's not what they really are trying to communicate. They just don't know how to. Give them that space to do it. And then you go back and show them how it's done because now they've hurt you by doing it the right way. That changes the behavior, versus anything else you do is never going to change the behavior.
I agree with what you're saying. But I also think that a lot of people are learning these things for the first time. And I do think it's important to try to learn it the correct way first. Because what you're saying is someone's still going to have to learn how to say things the right way. Like, they're still going to eventually have to learn that. So, it's good you mentioned that, because you don't have to be perfect right away. Right. And I think that's the point you're trying to make. But I don't think that it's necessarily a wrong thing to try to learn this from the very beginning in the right way, because then you'll have less to have to continue to learn. Like, you're always going to continue to have to learn things.
Right.
Like, people might watch this and be like, God, like, I have to learn more stuff. I'm always going to be learning stuff. But it's for your peace. It's for the betterment of your life. And so I get what you're saying. Like, if you're just trying to focus on listening to your partner,
right,
and you're doing that part first, but I think you also still should pay attention to the words that you're saying, and just realize that it's probably not going to be perfect the first times that you're doing it.
Yeah.
But you are eventually going to have to learn how to talk in a way that doesn't hurt the person that you're talking to. So it's still going to be something that you're going to have to work on. So you can either choose, to focus on that while you're learning and just know that it's not going to be perfect. Or, just focus on one point of that, which might be listening, and then realize, though, that you're going to have to work on the other part eventually.